My name is Hazel Bennett, and am 32 years old. When the certified mail arrived at my modest apartment last Tuesday, I never imagined it would drag me back to the worst day of my childhood. The legal documents inside informed me that my biological parents, people I hadn't seen in 27 years, were suing me for $2.7 million. As I read their names, Denise and Travis Holloway, the smell of cinnamon pretzels filled my memory, transporting me instantly back to that December afternoon when I was 5 years old, standing in front of a toy store, clutching a stuffed rabbit and waiting for a mother who would never return. They left me crying and alone, and now they want the inheritance my adoptive father left me. Before we dive deeper into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. If this story resonates with you, or if you believe in the power of chosen family over biology, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear how this legal nightmare unfolded. Trust me, what happened next will shock you, so let's get into it. It was December 1998, 3 weeks before Christmas, at the Riverside Shopping Mall in suburban Ohio. I remember every detail of that day like it happened yesterday. The mall was decorated with twinkling lights, enormous red bows, and a giant Christmas tree that seemed to touch the ceiling. Holiday music played from speakers hidden somewhere above, and the crowds of shoppers rushed past carrying bags filled with wrapped presents. I was wearing a red velvet dress that my mother Denise had bought from a thrift store, and I held my most precious possession tightly in my arms, a worn stuffed rabbit I called Mr. Hoppy. My parents, Denise and Travis Holloway, had taken me to the mall that Saturday afternoon, which was unusual because we rarely went anywhere as a family. I remember feeling excited, hoping maybe we'd get hot chocolate or look at the toys, even though I knew we probably couldn't afford to buy anything. We walked past the food court, where the smell of cinnamon pretzels mixed with pizza and fried chicken, past the fountain where people threw pennies and made wishes, and stopped in front of a toy store with a massive display of dolls in the window. My mother knelt down to my eye level, smoothed my hair with her hand, and said the words that would change my life forever. "Mommy needs to use the restroom, honey. Wait right here by this bench, okay? Don't move, I'll be right back." My father, Travis, stood nearby, hands in his pockets, not looking at me, his jaw tight. I nodded obediently, clutching Mr. Hoppy closer, and sat down on the cold metal bench. I watched them walk away, my mother's blonde ponytail swinging, my father's hunched shoulders disappearing into the crowd. I waited like a good girl, counting the tiles on the floor, watching other families walk by, holding hands, swinging shopping bags, laughing together. 1 hour passed, then 2, then 3. The mall grew more crowded as the afternoon stretched into evening. My legs hurt from sitting still, and my stomach growled because we hadn't eaten lunch. Other shoppers started noticing me, a small girl alone on a bench, and their stares made me feel strange, like I'd done something wrong. Some whispered to each other while glancing my way, but no one approached me at first. The Christmas music that had seemed cheerful earlier now sounded hollow and too loud. A mall security officer, an elderly man with kind eyes whose name tag read Stewart, finally stopped and knelt beside me. "Where are your parents, sweetheart?" he asked gently. "Mommy went to the bathroom." I told him, my voice small. She said, "Shed, be right back." Officer Stewart stayed with me for a while, scanning the crowds, asking if I recognized anyone passing by. When another hour passed with no sign of my parents, he took my hand and led me to the security office, a small room with monitors and a desk cluttered with papers. That's when they made the announcement over the mall's speaker system, the words echoing through every corridor and store. "Would the parents of a little girl please come to the security office near the main entrance? Your daughter is waiting for you." My heart leaped with hope every time the door opened, certain it would be my mother rushing in to hug me and apologize for taking so long. But each time it was someone else, a janitor, another security guard, concerned shoppers asking if I was okay. As the evening turned to night and the mall prepared to close, Officer Stewart reached into my dress pocket, checking for identification, and found a folded piece of notebook paper. He opened it carefully, read it, and his expression changed from concern to something sadder. He showed it to his supervisor, and they both looked at me with pity that made my chest hurt. The note, written in my mother's messy handwriting, said simply, "We can't do this anymore. Please forgive us." Detective Quinn Fletcher arrived shortly after, a tall woman with short dark hair and a badge clipped to her belt. She spoke to me in a soft voice, asking my name, my parents' names, where we lived, but I could barely answer because Eid started crying so hard I couldn't breathe. She called more officers, and they went to our apartment, but the landlord told them we'd been evicted 2 weeks earlier, and my parents had cleared out without leaving a forwarding address. The phone numbers I managed to remember through my tears were all disconnected. By midnight, a social services caseworker named Ruth Morrison arrived, a tired-looking woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a bun. She carried a folder and spoke in the same gentle voice adults use when they're about to tell you something terrible. "Hazel, honey, we're going to find you a safe place to sleep tonight, okay? Everything is going to be all right." But I knew, even at 5 years old, that nothing would ever be all right again. I spent that first night in an emergency foster placement with a woman named Yolanda Green, whose house smelled like cigarettes and fried food. The bedroom I was put in had 2 bunk beds with 3 other children already asleep, strangers whose faces I couldn't see in the dark. I lay awake, clutching Mr. Hoppy, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, straining to hear every car that passed outside, convinced each one might be my mother coming back to get me. When Mrs. Green brought me a plate of dinner, I couldn't eat, my throat too tight with fear and confusion. I kept asking the same question over and over until my voice went hoarse. What if Mommy comes back and can't find me? What if she's looking for me at the mall right now? Mrs. Green didn't have an answer that made sense to a 5-year-old, whose entire world had shattered in the time it takes to walk to a bathroom. That night, I threw up from crying so hard, and Mrs. Green cleaned it up without complaint, but her eyes held the same pity I'd seen in everyone else's faces, and I hated it. The Green household became my first real experience of foster care, and it taught me quickly that the world was not a safe place for unwanted children. Yolanda Green was not cruel, but she was overwhelmed, caring for 4 other foster children in addition to her own 2 biological kids in a small 3-bedroom house that always smelled faintly of mildew and overcooked vegetables. There was never enough attention to go around, never enough quiet, never enough space. Meals were chaotic affairs with children grabbing food off plates, arguing over the television remote, and Mrs. Green shouting for order while talking on the phone with caseworkers or her boyfriend. I learned to stay quiet, to make myself small, to eat quickly before the older kids took food from my plate. Kindergarten became another nightmare because I started acting out, pushing other children when they got too close, refusing to participate in activities, and wetting my bed almost every night. The school called Mrs. Green repeatedly, concerned about my behavior, but she had too many other problems to focus on one traumatized 5-year-old. When Ruth Morrison visited for her monthly check-ins, I learned to fake smiles and say everything was fine because I'd already figured out that admitting things were bad might mean being moved somewhere worse. After 6 months, I was transferred to my second foster home with the Patterson family, Dale and Francine, and at first, it seemed like a dream come true. They lived in a big house with a manicured lawn in a nice neighborhood where kids rode bikes on quiet streets. Francine greeted me with a hug and showed me a bedroom decorated with pink curtains and a stuffed animal collection on the shelves. "You're going to love it here, sweetie," she said with a bright smile. For the first week, I believed her. But the mask slipped quickly once the caseworker stopped making frequent visits. Francine's voice, so sweet in front of Ruth Morrison, turned sharp and cold when we were alone. "You should be grateful we even feed you," she hissed, when I accidentally spilled juice on the kitchen floor. "Do you know how many kids would love to live in a house like this?" Dale, her husband, was rarely home, always traveling for his job in pharmaceutical sales, and when he was there, he seemed blind to his wife's cruelty, or perhaps he simply didn't care. Their biological daughter Melody, a year younger than me, quickly learned she could get away with anything by blaming me, and Francine always believed her precious angel over the foster kid. The comparisons were constant and deliberate, designed to remind me I didn't belong. Melody got all A's on her report card. "Why can't you focus like her?" Francine would say, even though Melody was in preschool and didn't receive letter grades. "Melody finished all her vegetables, but you're too ungrateful to appreciate good food." The punishments were disguised as chores: scrubbing floors with a toothbrush, washing walls, organizing the garage in the summer heat, while Melody played in the air-conditioned house. Francine controlled food like a weapon, giving me noticeably smaller portions at dinner, and I learned that school lunches were my only reliable meals. I started hoarding snacks from school in my pockets, crackers, and apple slices, eating them in my room at night when my stomach cramped with hunger. The other kids at school started noticing I wore the same 3 outfits on rotation, that my shoes were too small and pinched my toes, that I always looked tired with dark circles under my eyes. Some were kind, sharing their lunches without being asked, but others were cruel in the way children can be, asking loudly why I looked so dirty, why I didn't have a real family. The breaking point came when I was 7 years old, on an afternoon I still have nightmares about. Melody received a new toy for her birthday, an expensive doll with a wardrobe of tiny clothes and accessories. She played with it for exactly 1 day before growing bored and leaving it on the living room floor. I made the mistake of picking it up, carefully dressing it in a little blue dress, pretending for a moment that I had something beautiful that belonged to me. When Melody came back and saw me touching her toy, she snatched it away, and in the struggle, the doll's arm broke off. Melody's face transformed, and she started screaming like it attacked her. Francine came running, and before I could explain what happened, Melody sobbed that I'd broken her doll on purpose because I was jealous. Francine's rage was terrifying, her face turning red, spit flying from her mouth as she screamed at me. She grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises and dragged me to the basement door. "You want to act like a brat? You can sit in the dark and think about what you've done." She shoved me down the stairs and I fell, scraping my knees on the concrete floor. The door slammed shut, and I heard the lock click. The basement was unfinished, damp and cold, with bare bulbs that Francine didn't turn on. The only light came from a small window near the ceiling, and as the afternoon faded to evening, even that disappeared. I was terrified of the dark, had been since the night at the mall, and I screamed until my throat was raw, pounding on the door until my fists hurt. 4 hours passed in that darkness, 4 hours that felt like days, where every shadow became a monster, and every sound made me flinch. I pressed myself into a corner, arms wrapped around my knees, crying silently because I'd learned that loud crying only made Francine angrier. What saved me was a neighbor, Mrs. Adelaide Hunt, an elderly woman who lived next door and had always been kind, waving when she saw me in the yard. She was in her garden that evening and heard my muffled crying through the basement window. She came to the front door and knocked, asking Francine if everything was all right, if she'd heard a child crying. Francine lied smoothly, saying I was upstairs taking a nap, but Mrs. Hunt insisted she'd heard distress and said she'd already called the police to do a welfare check. Within an hour, officers arrived, and when they found me locked in the basement, dehydrated and trembling, they called Ruth Morrison immediately. I was removed that night, and I never saw the Patterson house again. My third foster home was with the Shaw family, Vernon and Iris, and it became clear within days that they saw foster care as a business rather than a calling. They had 8 foster children crammed into a 4-bedroom house, 3 kids to a room, sleeping on bunk beds and air mattresses. The house always smelled like dirty laundry and spoiled milk, and meal times were chaotic free-for-alls, where the strongest and fastest kids got the most food. Vernon worked nights at a factory, sleeping during the day, while Iris spent most of her time on the phone or watching television, barely supervising the children. The food in the refrigerator was often expired, the milk sour, the bread moldy, and we learned to check everything before eating it. An older foster child named Garrett, a 15-year-old with anger issues and a history of being bounced between homes, established himself as the house bully. He stole toys from younger kids, threatened violence if anyone told on him, and created an atmosphere of fear that Iris either didn't notice or didn't care about. I learned to hide my few possessions, keeping Mr. Hoppy tucked under my mattress, and to stay invisible, avoiding Garrett's attention by never making eye contact or speaking unless spoken to. After 3 months, a state inspection shut down the Shaw home for multiple violations, and all of us were scattered to different placements once again. I was 8 years old when I met Walter Bennett, and I didn't trust him at first, because I'd learned the hard way that adults who seemed kind often had ulterior motives. My 4th foster placement was with the Montgomery family, a middle-aged couple who ran a cleaner but impersonal home where foster children came and went like guests in a motel. It wasn't abusive, but it wasn't loving either, just a place to exist until the next move. Walter was 55 years old, a widowed architect whose wife Dorothy had died of cancer 2 years earlier, and he volunteered with a program called Big Hearts that matched professionals with foster children as mentors. The program coordinator brought him to the Montgomery house on a Saturday morning in October, introducing him to several children in the common room. Most of the kids crowded around him immediately, eager for any adult attention, but I stayed in the corner with a worn copy of Charlotte's Web, pretending to read while watching him carefully from behind my hair. Walter didn't push or force interaction like some volunteers did, trying too hard to be liked. Instead, he noticed me after a while and walked over slowly, keeping a respectful distance, and asked what I was reading. Charlotte's Web. I mumbled, not looking up. That's a wonderful story, he said, his voice gentle and genuine. Have you gotten to the part where Charlotte writes the words in her web yet? I nodded slightly, still wary. Which word is your favorite so far? He asked. I thought about it, then whispered, humble. Because Wilbur learns he doesn't have to be the most special pig to be worth saving. Walter smiled, and something in his expression wasn't pity or condescension, but understanding. That's very wise, he said. May I sit here and read my book too? I brought one about architecture, which probably isn't as interesting as yours, but he'd enjoy the company. I shrugged, which he took as permission, and he sat in the chair across from me, pulling out a thick book filled with building sketches. We sat in comfortable silence for an hour, just reading, and when he left that day, he didn't make any promises or grand gestures. He just said, "I'll be back next Saturday if you'd like to read together again." True to his word, Walter returned every Saturday for the next 6 months, and slowly, carefully, I began to trust him. He brought books, art supplies, and interesting stories about buildings he'd designed, but he never pushed me to talk about my past or share my feelings before I was ready. He took me to the library, where he got me my very own library card, and I felt like I'd been given a treasure. We went to the park, where he pushed me on the swings without talking, just letting me feel the wind and the sun. He took me to the Children's Museum, where we spent hours looking at exhibits, and he answered my endless questions about how things worked with patience and enthusiasm. Walter never made promises he couldn't keep, never said "I'll always be here" or "everything will be okay" like other adults did, because he understood those words were meaningless to a child who'd been abandoned and shuffled through foster homes. Instead, he showed up consistently, week after week, and his actions slowly built a foundation of trust. When I finally opened up about being left at the mall, about the note, about the foster homes, Walter's reaction was different from others I'd told. He didn't cry or hug me or tell me how sorry he was. He just listened, his jaw tight with quiet anger, and when I finished, he said something I'd never heard before. "You deserved better, Hazel, and you still do. What happened to you was wrong, and none of it was your fault." Those words cracked something open inside me, and I started crying, not the silent tears I'd learned to hide, but deep, gasping sobs. Walter asked if he could hug me, and when I nodded, he held me while I cried years of grief and anger into his shoulder. After that day, something shifted between us, and Walter started talking to Ruth Morrison about a possibility I didn't dare hope for. 3 months later, at the end of one of our Saturday visits, he knelt down to my eye level and said, "Hazel, I've been thinking. My house is too quiet and too big for just me, and I could really use someone to share it with. Would you maybe want to come live with me? Not as foster care, but as my daughter. I'd like to adopt you if you'd let me." I stared at him, certain I'd misheard, or that this was some cruel joke. "Why?" I whispered. "Why would you want me?" Walter's eyes got shiny with tears, but he smiled. "Because you're smart, and kind, and brave, and you make me laugh. Because every Saturday, I look forward to seeing you all week. Because I think we could be a family, if you're willing to take a chance on an old architect who can't cook and tells terrible jokes." I wanted to say yes immediately, but years of disappointment had taught me to be cautious. "What if you change your mind?" I asked, voicing my deepest fear. "What if you decide you don't want me anymore?" Walter took my hands in his. "I can't promise that life will be perfect, Hazel, but I can promise that I will never abandon you. I will never leave you wondering if you matter. You will always have a home with me." The adoption process took 8 months of home studies, background checks, and court appearances, and every step of the way, I waited for Walter to realize he'd made a mistake and back out, but he never did. On a sunny October afternoon in 2002, 9-year-old Hazel Holloway became Hazel Bennett in a courtroom before Judge Beatrice Holbrook. Walter wore a suit and tie, and I wore a new dress head bought specifically for the occasion, blue with white flowers. When the judge pronounced us legally father and daughter, Walter cried openly, and I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. We went out for ice cream afterward, and Walter let me order the biggest sundae on the menu with extra hot fudge. He took me to my new home, a cozy 3-bedroom house with a front porch and a backyard, and showed me my room. He'd painted it lavender at my request, installed bookshelves already filled with books, and put a comfortable window seat with cushions where I could read. "This is your forever home, Hazel," he said. "You never have to leave unless you choose to." I still didn't fully believe him, spent the first few weeks waiting for the catch, the moment when he'd reveal this was all temporary. But Walter was patient, and slowly, through countless small moments of consistency and love, I began to accept that maybe, just maybe, I was finally safe. The first 3 years with Walter were the happiest of my life. By the time I turned 12, I was thriving in school, making friends, and going to therapy twice a month to process the trauma of my early childhood. Walter and I developed rituals that made our house feel like a real home. Friday night movie marathons with popcorn, Sunday morning pancakes that Walter burned more often than not, and evening walks around the neighborhood where we talked about everything and nothing. He taught me to draw, showing me basic architectural sketching techniques, and I discovered I had a talent for seeing how buildings fit together. Walter's architecture firm was successful, with projects throughout the state, and he often brought me to his office on weekends, letting me sit at the drafting table and experiment with designs. He celebrated my birthdays with parties, decorated the house for holidays, and attended every school, concert, and art show, always in the front row with his camera. Life felt stable and safe for the first time I could remember, which is probably why I didn't see the storm coming. Walter had a younger sister named Geraldine Bennett Clark, and they'd been estranged for years over a dispute about their parents' inheritance after both died within months of each other. Geraldine felt Walter had manipulated their elderly mother into leaving him more of the estate, while Walter maintained he'd simply been the one who actually cared for their mother during her final illness, while Geraldine visited twice a year. They hadn't spoken in over a decade when Geraldine suddenly reached out, claiming she wanted to mend fences and reunite the family. Walter was cautious but hopeful, and after several phone conversations, he agreed to host Thanksgiving dinner at our home. Geraldine arrived with her husband Preston Clark, a slick real estate investor who wore expensive suits and cologne that smelled like money, and their adult children, Bradford, who was 27 and worked in his father's business, and Louisa, who was 25 and seemed to float through life on her parents' wealth without any job or purpose. The dinner was uncomfortable from the first moment they walked through the door. Geraldine swept in with a fake warm smile, hugging Walter while her eyes assessed everything in the house, calculating the value of the furniture, the artwork, the square footage. She turned to me with that same artificial sweetness and said, "And this must be Hazel. How wonderful that Walter found you." The emphasis on found rather than adopted or daughter was subtle but deliberate, a reminder that I wasn't real family. Throughout dinner, she peppered Walter with questions about his business, his investments, his retirement plans, all framed as sisterly concern, but clearly fishing for financial information. Preston was even less subtle, asking outright about property values, Walter's portfolio, whether he'd considered selling the firm. Bradford barely acknowledged my existence, scrolling through his phone during dinner and responding to his mother's questions with bored monosyllables. Louisa at least attempted conversation, but her compliments were all backhanded, little knives wrapped in smiles. "You speak so well for a foster child," she said, and when I stiffened, she added quickly, "I mean that as a compliment. So many kids from difficult backgrounds struggle, but you seem almost normal." After dinner, while I was helping Walter clean up in the kitchen, I heard voices from the living room where the relatives had gathered. The kitchen door was slightly open, and their conversation carried clearly. Geraldine's voice, which had been so warm earlier, now had an edge like broken glass. "Walter, are you absolutely sure about this adoption situation?" I mean, she seems like a nice enough girl, but have you really thought this through? Preston chimed in. What Geraldine means is, these foster kids come with baggage. What if her real family shows up someday and causes legal problems? You could be opening yourself up to liability. I froze, dishes in my hands, ice spreading through my chest. Walter's response was firm. Hazel is my daughter, not a situation or liability. The adoption is legal and final. Geraldine's laugh was forced. Of course. We're just concerned. And let's be honest, Walter, you're not getting any younger. Have you updated your estate planning? What happens to your assets when you're gone? Preston added. We're talking about the family business, properties, investments. These things should stay in the bloodline, you understand. Walter's voice went cold in a way I'd never heard before. Let me be very clear. Hazel is my daughter. She is my heir. When I die, everything I have goes to her. End of discussion. There was a long silence, and then Geraldine spoke again, her voice tight. Well, that's certainly you're right, Walter. We just want what's best for everyone involved. The conversation shifted to other topics, but the damage was done. I set down the dishes carefully, my hands shaking, and Walter walked into the kitchen, saw my face, and knew immediately that I'd overheard. He pulled me into a hug and said, They don't get a vote, Hazel. You're my family, and nothing they say changes that. But even as he reassured me, I could see the anger in his eyes, the realization that his sister's sudden interest in reconciliation had nothing to do with family bonds and everything to do with money. After they left that evening, Walter limited contact with them, but Geraldine was persistent, calling weekly under various pretexts, always circling back to questions about estate planning and suggesting Walter should provide for blood relatives too. The subtle undermining began shortly after that Thanksgiving. Christmas gifts arrived at the house, expensive presents for Walter and a token gift card for me, the message clear about who mattered. When Walter invited them to my 8th grade graduation, they showed up late, sat in the back, and left immediately after without congratulating me. Family photos were carefully staged to exclude me, or I'd be positioned at the edge of the frame where I could easily be cropped out. Geraldine made comments to Walter during phone calls, always within my earshot, about how exhausting it must be, raising a teenager alone at his age, planting seeds of doubt about my gratitude and his burden. Foster children often have attachment issues, you know, she said once, her voice dripping false concern. They struggle to bond properly. I just hope she appreciates everything you're doing for her. Walter shut down these comments immediately, but they still lodged in my brain like splinters, making me wonder if I was being difficult, if I was too much trouble, if maybe Geraldine was right, and I didn't deserve what Walter had given me. By the time I reached high school, I'd mostly learned to ignore Walter's relatives and focus on building my own life. I excelled academically, making the honor roll every semester, and threw myself into the art club, where I became president my sophomore year. I'd developed a real passion for architecture, inspired by Walter, and dreamed of attending a competitive college program to follow in his footsteps. Walter was incredibly proud, attending every school event from parent-teacher conferences to art shows, always carrying his camera and beaming with genuine joy at my accomplishments. But his health was starting to show small warning signs: fatigue that lasted longer, occasional shortness of breath, and I noticed him taking more medications, though he brushed off my concerns with jokes about getting old. What I didn't know was that his relatives were watching and planning, seeing his declining health as an opportunity rather than a reason to offer support. Bradford, Geraldine's son, made a move that should have raised immediate red flags but seemed innocent at first. He announced he was relocating to our town, taking a job at a local real estate firm, claiming he wanted a change from the city and to be closer to family. Walter thought it was nice that his nephew wanted to reconnect, but I felt uneasy watching Bradford insert himself into our community. He started showing up at events where I volunteered, at the library where I tutored younger kids, at community fundraisers where Walter's firm had a presence. Bradford was charming in public, always smiling and friendly, but I noticed him talking to people about me, framing his questions as family concern. I overheard him once speaking to one of my teachers in the school parking lot, his voice carrying concern I knew was fake. "We're just worried about my uncle, you know? He's getting older, and we want to make sure has not being taken advantage of. Foster kids sometimes have issues with boundaries and gratitude. Has Hazel shown any behavioral problems? Any signs she might be manipulating him? The real sabotage came during my junior year when I applied for a prestigious architectural scholarship program that selected 10 high school students from across the region for mentorship, portfolio development, and a guaranteed pathway to top architecture schools. It was incredibly competitive, requiring a portfolio of original designs, an essay, and an interview with the selection committee. I worked for months on my submission, creating detailed sketches of a community center design that incorporated sustainable materials and accessible spaces, writing and rewriting my essay about how architecture could heal and transform communities. Walter helped me refine my technical skills, but insisted the work be entirely mine, refusing to let me submit anything that wasn't authentically my creation. I submitted everything well before the deadline and then waited nervously for the interview invitation. When it didn't come, I called the organization and was told there was a problem with my application. According to their records, my portfolio had been flagged for potential plagiarism, with allegations that my designs were actually Walter's work that I'd copied and claimed as my own. I was devastated and confused because every line of every drawing had been done by my own hand, and anyone who compared my amateur student work to Walter's professional designs would see they were completely different in style and sophistication. The organization required an investigation, which meant interviews with my teachers, examination of my process work, and verification of authenticity. By the time they cleared me of the false allegations and confirmed my work was original, the deadline for the scholarship had passed and the positions had been filled. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach, watching an opportunity that could have changed my future evaporate because someone had lied about me. Walter was furious and immediately started asking questions, pulling strings with colleagues, and demanding to know who had made the plagiarism claim. The organization was reluctant to reveal the source, citing confidentiality, but eventually admitted that a family member had contacted them expressing concern, providing what he claimed was evidence of my academic dishonesty. That family member was Bradford. When Walter confronted his nephew, Bradford denied everything, his face a mask of innocent confusion. "I would never do that, Uncle Walter. I was asking questions out of concern. Maybe someone misunderstood my intentions. But the timeline was too specific, the allegations too detailed, and Walter wasn't fooled." He called Geraldine, who immediately defended her son, her voice rising with indignation. "How dare you accuse Bradford? He was trying to help. Maybe the real problem is that you've become blind to this girl's manipulation. You're choosing her over your own blood family." Walter's response was cold and final. "She is my family. And you and your children need to stay away from us. This harassment ends now." He hung up and immediately contacted his attorney to draft a formal cease and desist letter, warning that continued interference would result in a restraining order. The family rift that had been barely covered over now split wide open, but I knew this wasn't the end. People motivated by greed don't give up easily, they just get sneakier. The attacks continued, but became more subtle and harder to trace directly. My social media accounts were suddenly targeted by anonymous profiles posting cruel comments about foster kids and abandonment. Photos of me from school events were shared with captions suggesting I was a gold digger using an old man for his money. Louisa had befriended one of my classmates, a girl named Tessa Hoffman, who I'd considered a friend, and started pumping her for information about my life, then twisting those details into gossip that spread through school. Rumors circulated that I was taking advantage of Walter, that I'd manipulated my way into adoption, that I didn't really care about him and was just waiting for him to die so I could inherit his money. The cyberbullying got bad enough that I had to delete my social media accounts, and I started eating lunch alone in the library to avoid the whispers and stares. Walter noticed my withdrawal and gently pushed until I explained what was happening. His face went through several emotions: sadness, rage, protectiveness, before settling on grim determination. He made more calls to his attorney, documented everything, and took steps to protect me legally and financially that I wouldn't fully understand until years later. Walter changed his will, making it explicitly clear that Geraldine, Preston, Bradford, and Louisa were to receive nothing from his estate, with specific language stating this was due to their harassment of his daughter. He established a trust with me as the sole beneficiary, structured in a way that would be nearly impossible to contest in probate court. He installed security cameras around our house after we noticed Geraldine's car driving past slowly multiple times, clearly checking if Walter was healthy enough to be working, hoping for signs of decline. He kept meticulous documentation of every incident of harassment, every false allegation, every attempt to undermine our relationship. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious and maybe even paranoid, but Walter had spent decades as an architect learning to anticipate structural weaknesses and plan for every contingency. He was building legal fortifications the same way Head once designed buildings, making sure the structure would hold firm against any attack. One evening during my senior year, Geraldine showed up at our house unannounced, mascara running, claiming she was sorry and begging for reconciliation. "Walter, please. I've made mistakes, but you're my only brother. Can't we put this behind us? I'll make my children apologize. I'll make sure they leave Hazel alone. She was a good actress. I'll give her that." Tears at the exact right moments, voice breaking with emotion. Walter was torn because despite everything, she was his sister, and he wasn't a cruel man. He agreed to a conditional reconciliation, with the explicit understanding that any further harassment of me would mean permanent estrangement. Geraldine agreed profusely, thanking him, hugging him, promising everything would be different. For about a year, there was an uneasy peace. They kept their distance mostly, sent cards on holidays, made no overt moves. But I could feel the resentment simmering underneath. See it in Bradford's eyes during the few family gatherings Walter insisted on. Notice it in the way Louisa looked at our house like she was already redecorating it in her mind. They were waiting, patient as wolves, for the right moment to strike. I was accepted to the State University's architecture program on a full scholarship at 18, a combination of merit and financial need that made college affordable without draining Walter's resources. I was excited about dorming, about the independence of campus life. But those plans changed quickly when Walter's health took a serious turn. The fatigue and shortness of breath that had been dismissing for months turned out to be symptoms of significant heart disease. His cardiologist delivered news that hit like a bomb. Walter needed lifestyle changes, medication, monitoring, and possibly surgery in the future. He tried to downplay it, not wanting to burden me or interfere with my college plans. But I could see the fear in his eyes, the way he moved more carefully, the new bottles of medication that appeared on the kitchen counter. I made the decision without consulting him first, telling the university I'd be commuting from home rather than living on campus. Walter protested, insisting I shouldn't sacrifice my college experience to take care of him, but I was firm. "You took care of me when I had no one. This isn't even a question, Dad. I'm staying." Living at home while attending college meant I could monitor Walter's health, make sure he took his medications, drive him to appointments, and cook healthier meals than the frozen dinners Head survive on otherwise. It also meant I noticed how conspicuously absent his relatives were during this time. Geraldine called occasionally, but her questions were always about Walter's estate planning and business assets rather than his actual health. Bradford and Louisa never visited, never offered to help, never even sent a card. The few people who did show up consistently were Walter's longtime friends and colleagues, people who'd known him for decades and genuinely cared whether he lived or died. I learned a lot about family during those years, about how the people who claim blood bonds often disappear when actual work is required, while chosen family shows up with groceries and offers to sit with you in waiting rooms. Walter's architecture firm had been his life's work, but he made the difficult decision to sell it during my sophomore year of college when his doctors said the stress was literally killing him. The sale brought in $3.2 million, which combined with his investments and 3 rental properties meant his total estate was worth approximately $4.5 million. He was meticulous about the transition, working with his attorney Howard Lansing to ensure everything was structured correctly, establishing the trust head created years earlier with ironclad provisions. He gave me medical power of attorney, the legal right to make healthcare decisions if he became incapacitated, and I accepted the responsibility with a heavy heart, hoping I'd never have to use it. When Geraldine found out about the power of attorney through some gossip network of her own, she called Walter in a fury. "I'm your sister. How could you give that authority to her instead of your own blood?" Walter's response was tired but firm. "She's my daughter, Geraldine. She's the one who's here. She's the one I trust. This conversation is over. The first heart attack came during the fall of my junior year, and it was terrifying in a way nothing else had been. I found Walter collapsed in the kitchen one morning, conscious but clutching his chest, his face gray with pain. The ambulance ride felt like it took hours, though it was only minutes, and I sat in the emergency room holding his hand while doctors rushed around, hooking him up to machines, starting IVs, running tests. He spent 2 weeks in the ICU, his heart damaged but still fighting, and I was at his bedside every day, missing classes, falling behind on assignments, but unable to imagine being anywhere else. That's when Geraldine showed up, sweeping into the ICU like she owned the place, demanding to speak with doctors about her brother's condition and treatment options. When the hospital staff asked for identification and checked records showing I held medical power of attorney, Geraldine exploded. "She's not even blood family. She's a foster kid he picked up, and you're letting her make decisions about my brother's life." The hospital social worker, a calm woman named Patricia, intervened and escorted Geraldine to a private office to review the legal documents. Walter had been thorough, everything properly notarized and filed, giving me complete authority over his medical decisions. Geraldine tried every angle, claiming Walter had been manipulated, suggesting I was keeping him sedated to maintain control, even hinting that I might want him to die so I could inherit. Patricia shut down each accusation with professional coldness, and security eventually removed Geraldine from the hospital after she caused a scene in the hallway. I found her later in the parking lot, and she approached me with venom in her eyes. "You think you've won, but this isn't over. That money should go to real family, not some throwaway kid from a mall." Her words hurt because they were designed to, targeting the deepest wound I carried, but I stood straight and looked her in the eye. "I love him, which is more than you've ever done. When he recovers, you won't be welcome in his life anymore." Walter did recover, though he was permanently weakened, moving slower, tiring more easily, looking older than his 68 years. He retired completely from work, spending his days reading, doing small sketches for his own pleasure, and taking short walks around the neighborhood with me when the weather was nice. I graduated with my bachelor's degree in architecture, and Walter was there in his wheelchair, front row at the ceremony, crying openly with pride. We had 3 more years together, and they were bittersweet, filled with long conversations about life and death, about his late wife Dorothy, who I wished I could have known, about his regrets and hopes. He told me stories from his childhood, shared memories of his career's proudest moments, and made sure I understood that I'd given him purpose during what would have been the loneliest years of his life. "You saved me as much as I saved you," he said one evening while we sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Maybe more." I held his hand and tried not to think about the inevitable. The final months were hard. A second heart attack, more severe than the first, left Walter requiring home hospice care. I took a leave from the graduate program I'd started, moving back into his house full-time to manage his care with the help of hospice nurses. He was in and out of consciousness, pain managed with medications that kept him comfortable but foggy. That's when Geraldine started making unannounced visits, showing up at the house with flimsy excuses about wanting to see her brother one last time. I caught her twice going through his home office, looking through files, clearly trying to find information about his assets and estate planning. The second time, I ordered her out of the house, and she left, but not before hissing threats about lawyers and lawsuits. Walter died peacefully on a Tuesday morning in March, age 71, with me holding his hand and telling him it was okay to let go. His last words, whispered so quietly I almost missed them, were, "I'm so proud of you. Live a beautiful life." I promised him I would, though in that moment I couldn't imagine how life would ever feel beautiful again. The will reading took place 2 weeks after Walter's funeral in Howard Lansing's law office, a somber room with dark wood paneling and shelves filled with legal books. I sat on one side of the conference table, while Geraldine, Preston, Bradford, and Louisa arranged themselves on the other like a hostile board of directors. Howard, a distinguished man in his 60s, who'd been Walter's attorney and friend for over 30 years, read the will with professional detachment, but I could see the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Walter had left $200,000 to various foster care organizations, charities that supported children aging out of the system, and programs that matched mentors with kids who needed them. $100,000 went to Mrs. Nell Patterson, Walter's housekeeper who worked for him for 20 years and had been unfailingly kind to me. The remaining $4 million, after medical expenses and final costs, went entirely to me. No surprise gifts for relatives, no consolation amounts, just a clean distribution that made Walter's intentions crystal clear. Geraldine's face went from expectant to confused to enraged in the span of seconds. She stood up so fast her chair tipped over, slamming her hands on the table. "This is robbery! That money belongs to Walter's family, his real family." Preston was already on his phone, presumably calling their own attorney, while Bradford and Louisa just stared at me with naked hatred. Howard remained calm, folding his hands over the will. "Mrs. Clark, the will is legally sound, properly witnessed, and reflects Walter's clearly stated wishes. Any contest would be unsuccessful and expensive." Geraldine leaned across the table toward me, and Howard moved to stand between us. "You manipulated him, poisoned him against his own sister, isolated him so you could steal his money. We're going to fight this, and we're going to win." Howard's voice went cold. "I'd advise you not to make threats in my office. This meeting is concluded." Security escorted Walter's relatives out while they shouted about lawyers and lawsuits, their voices echoing down the hallway. I had 6 months of relative peace after that, time to grieve properly, to process the enormous loss of the only parent who'd ever truly loved me. I finished my graduate degree, earning a master's in architecture while living in Walter's house, unable to bring myself to sell it yet because every room held memories I wasn't ready to release. I used the inheritance responsibly, paying off my student loans, making modest investments, setting up retirement accounts, buying nothing extravagant or frivolous because that wasn't who Walter raised me to be. I started volunteering with a foster care mentorship program, trying to be for other kids what Walter had been for me, and that work brought more healing than anything else. I thought about Walter every day, talked to his photo on bad nights, and slowly started to believe I could build a life he'd be proud of. That fragile peace shattered when the certified mail arrived on a Tuesday morning 6 months after his death. The envelope contained legal documents that made my hands shake as I read them. Denise and Travis Holloway, my biological parents who'd abandoned me in a mall 27 years earlier, were suing me for $2.7 million. The lawsuit claimed wrongful inheritance, alleging that as my biological parents, they had a right to assets intended for family, and that I'd manipulated Walter into cutting out his relatives and leaving everything to me. They claimed alienation of affection, suggesting I'd deliberately prevented them from reconnecting with me, and that Walter's adoption had been improper. The monetary demand was specific, $2.7 million out of the $4 million I'd inherited, leaving me with just enough to not be destitute but taking the majority of what Walter had worked his entire life to build. I read the documents 3 times, each pass making me feel more sick, before calling Howard in a panic. Howard's reaction was a mix of anger and grim determination. "This is disgusting but not surprising. Let me do some investigating." Within a week, Head hired a private investigator named Curtis Vaughn, a former police detective with a reputation for thoroughness. Curtis discovered the conspiracy quickly because the people involved had been sloppy, too confident in their scheme to cover their tracks properly. Email records and phone logs showed that Geraldine had contacted Denise and Travis Holloway 6 months before Walter's death, finding them through public records and social media. Shed reached out with an offer too tempting for desperate people to refuse: help us contest the will, claim parental rights to the inheritance, and split the money. The proposed split was 40% to Geraldine's family, 60% to the Holloways if they won, with the clear goal of leaving me with nothing. Curtis found the Holloways, living in a rundown trailer park in rural Kentucky, their lives a wreck of failed businesses, heavy debts, and gambling problems. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain by going after money they had no moral right to. The first court appearance was a circus. The Holloways had hired Marshall Blackwell, a personal injury attorney with a reputation for taking questionable cases if the potential payout was big enough. He specialized in emotional manipulation, playing to juries' sympathies, and his strategy with Denise and Travis was to paint them as tragic figures who'd made a youthful mistake they'd regretted every day since. In his opening statement, Blackwell described them as young, overwhelmed parents who'd intended to come back to the mall but got lost, and then were too afraid of legal consequences to come forward. He claimed they'd tried to find me through social services but were blocked by the adoption, that they'd thought of me every day for 27 years, and that they deserved a chance to reconnect and to share in the family inheritance. It was a story designed to tug heartstrings, and I watched several people in the courtroom gallery nod sympathetically, while Denise dabbed at her eyes with a tissue and Travis looked appropriately remorseful. The media picked up the story because it had every element of clickbait drama: abandoned child, adoption, inheritance, feuding families, and suddenly, I was facing not just a legal battle but a public relations nightmare. Local news ran segments about the case, then national outlets picked it up, and soon it was trending on social media with hashtags and hot takes from people who knew nothing about the actual situation. The narrative Blackwell had crafted, regretful parents seeking reconciliation, gained traction with some people, while others saw through it and rallied to my defense. Denise gave a tearful interview to a news station, saying she'd made the biggest mistake of her life, leaving me at that mall, and had spent nearly 3 decades hoping for a chance to apologize and make things right. Travis played his part too. The strong, silent type who'd made a terrible choice but claimed he'd tried to be a better man. Comment sections filled with arguments, some people insisting biology mattered and parents deserved chances, others pointing out that abandonment for 27 years negated any parental rights. Howard worked methodically to build my defense, gathering evidence that told the real story. The original note Denise had left in my pocket, carefully preserved by social services, read, "We can't do this anymore. Please forgive us," with no mention of coming back or any intention to reclaim me. Police reports from that night showed no missing persons report had been filed, no frantic parents searching for a lost daughter. The landlord of their abandoned apartment testified that they'd cleared out owing 3 months' rent, taking everything in the middle of the night like people running from their responsibilities. 27 years of complete silence, no letters, no calls, no attempts at contact through any of the proper legal channels for parents seeking to reclaim parental rights. Howard assembled a timeline that showed a clear pattern. The Holloways had abandoned me deliberately, had never tried to find me, had moved multiple times without updating any information that would have allowed contact, and had only resurfaced when money was involved. The case was ugly, public, and exhausting, but Howard kept telling me the same thing: the law is on your side, and the truth is on your side. We just need to make sure the judge sees both clearly. The discovery phase of the trial revealed just how catastrophic the Holloways' lives had been since they abandoned me. Their financial records showed over $300,000 in debts from credit cards, personal loans, and gambling losses. They'd declared bankruptcy 3 times in 20 years, losing houses, cars, and businesses to foreclosure and repossession. Travis had been arrested twice for fraud schemes, once for writing bad checks, and once for a pyramid scheme investment con that had bilked elderly people out of their retirement savings. Denise had multiple DUIs on her record, a suspended driver's license, and a history of borrowing money from friends and family that she never repaid. Most damning of all, they had 2 other children, half-siblings I'd never known existed, who'd been taken by social services and placed in foster care after neighbors reported neglect. The pattern was unmistakable: chronic irresponsibility, impulsivity, and an inability to care for children that had nothing to do with being young or overwhelmed, but everything to do with fundamental character flaws. Geraldine's deposition was a highlight of the trial because Howard demolished her carefully constructed facade in under 2 hours. Under oath, she had to admit she'd contacted the Holloways, though she tried to frame it as wanting to reunite family out of concern for everyone involved. Howard produced the email evidence: messages between Geraldine and Denise discussing how they'd split Walter's money if the lawsuit succeeded, with specific percentages and calculations showing this was a financial conspiracy from the start. Geraldine's face flushed red as Howard read her own words aloud in the courtroom. "If we coordinate our efforts, we can make a strong case that she manipulated Walter. Between my testimony about family estrangement and your claim to parental rights, we can at least force a settlement." Howard looked at her over his reading glasses. "Mrs. Clark, would you say this sounds like someone concerned about family welfare, or someone motivated by money?" Geraldine stammered, trying to walk back the implications, but the damage was done. The jury could see exactly what she was: a greedy relative who'd weaponized desperate people to go after money she felt entitled to. When Denise took the stand, Blackwell coached her through a performance that might have been moving if any of it were true. She described being a young mother overwhelmed by responsibility, making a choice in a moment of panic that Shed regretted every second since. She claimed Shed tried to find me through social services, but was told the adoption was closed and she had no rights. She said Shed, driven by foster homes hoping to catch a glimpse of me, that Shed called agencies and been turned away, that the pain of losing me had destroyed her marriages and driven her to drink. It was an Oscar-worthy performance, complete with tears at exactly the right moments, and a voice that broke with emotion when she looked at me and said, "I'm so sorry, Hazel. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I've thought about you every single day." The problem was that every word was a lie, and Howard was about to prove it. Howard's cross-examination was surgical and brutal. He started by asking Denise to explain the note Shed left, and she claimed it was meant to be temporary, that Shed planned to come back within hours. Howard produced the police report showing no contact in the 48 hours after I was found, the critical window when a panicked parent would be frantically searching. He asked about the abandoned apartment, and Denise claimed they'd been evicted and had no choice, ignoring the fact that they'd packed everything and left no forwarding address. He asked about the lack of contact in 27 years, and Denise's explanations grew weaker with each question. Why no letter through the courts? I didn't know how. Why no attempt through social media once that became common? I was afraid she hated me. Why no child support payments, no attempt to establish parental rights when I was still a minor? I thought the adoption meant I couldn't. Howard let her dig herself deeper before revealing evidence that Shed successfully contacted social services about her other children years later, proving she knew exactly how to navigate the system when she wanted to. My testimony came on the third day of the trial, and I'd been dreading it because I knew I'd have to relive the worst memories of my life in front of strangers. Howard guided me through the story gently, starting with the day at the mall. I described waiting on the bench, the growing fear as hours passed, the moment I realized my parents weren't coming back. I talked about the note, about Officer Stewart finding me, about the series of foster homes where I was neglected, abused, and moved like a piece of furniture. I described meeting Walter, the slow building of trust, the adoption that gave me a real family for the first time in my life. And I looked directly at Denise and Travis when I said, 27 years, not one birthday card, not one phone call, not one letter, not one attempt to check if I was alive or dead. And now you want what he gave me after I spent years taking care of him while he died. My voice didn't shake because I was done being afraid of them. They were strangers who happened to share my DNA, nothing more. Character witnesses lined up to testify on my behalf, and their combined testimony painted a clear picture. Ruth Morrison, the caseworker who'd handled my case, described the trauma I'd suffered and the transformation that came after Walter adopted me. She testified that Shed kept records on file, and there had never been a single inquiry from the Holloways about my welfare in all the years Shed worked with foster children. Howard Lansing confirmed Walter's sound mental state when creating his will, his explicit wishes that everything go to me, and his concerns about Geraldine's greed. Colleagues from Walter's architecture firm spoke about the genuine father-daughter relationship Wed shared, how Head talked about me constantly with pride, how Id cared for him during his final illness when his blood relatives were nowhere to be found. My graduate program professors testified about my character, my work ethic, my merit-based achievements that proved I'd earned my success rather than manipulated anyone for it. The director of the foster care mentorship program described how I volunteered weekly to support kids going through what I'd survived, giving back rather than wallowing in bitterness. The smoking gun came near the end of the trial when Curtis Vaughn presented newly discovered evidence that demolished any remaining credibility the Holloways might have had. A former acquaintance of Travis had recorded a conversation at a bar 3 weeks before they filed the lawsuit, where a drunk Travis bragged about the scheme. "We're gonna get millions off the kid we dumped," Head said, his words slightly slurred but perfectly clear. "Some old guy adopted her and died rich, and his family wants to screw her over, so they found us. We split the money, and all we gotta do is cry about being sorry. Easiest money ever." The recording played in the courtroom, and you could hear Travis laughing about it, making jokes about easy money, and asking his friend if he wanted to invest in a business once the settlement came through. The silence after the recording ended was deafening, and Denise's face went white, while Travis looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Marshall Blackwell tried to rehabilitate his client's case by calling Bradford to testify, hoping to establish that I'd had been manipulative and had alienated Walter from his family, but it backfired spectacularly. Howard's cross-examination revealed Bradford's interference with my scholarship application, the false plagiarism allegations Head made to the organization. Under pressure, Bradford admitted Head contacted them to raise concerns, but claimed Head been genuinely worried about academic integrity. Howard produced email evidence showing Bradford had called 3 times in 1 week, had sent fabricated proof of plagiarism that didn't hold up to scrutiny, and had continued to interfere even after being told an investigation was underway. Then, Howard pivoted to the social media campaign, and Louisa's involvement came out under questioning. The anonymous accounts, the cruel posts targeting my foster background, the coordinated harassment. Judge Winston Caldwell, who'd been mostly impassive throughout the trial, leaned forward with obvious displeasure. It seems the manipulation in this case was coming from the other side, counselor. Closing arguments came at the end of a long week, and both sides gave it everything they had. Marshall Blackwell made an emotional appeal about the sacred bond between parents and children, suggesting that biology created obligations and rights that couldn't be severed by abandonment or time. He asked the jury to consider that people make mistakes, especially young people, and that Denise and Travis deserved compassion and a second chance. He glossed over the bar recording as meaningless drunk talk and tried to paint me as vindictive, someone who'd turned Walter against his family and now wanted to punish the parents who'd given me life. It was a desperate closing from someone who knew his case was sinking. But Blackwell was a good performer, and he managed to make it sound almost reasonable if you ignored all the actual evidence. Howard's closing was methodical and devastating, laying out the timeline of abandonment, the lack of contact, the pattern of irresponsibility in the Holloways' lives, and the conspiracy with Geraldine to steal money they had no moral or legal right to. He reminded the jury of Walter's clear intentions, documented in a legally sound will, created by a man of sound mind who'd spent years considering how to protect his daughter from exactly this kind of greed-motivated attack. He played the bar recording again, letting Travis' own words condemn him, then looked at the jury and said simply, "Blood doesn't make you family, love does, care does, showing up does." Walter Bennett showed up for Hazel when her biological parents threw her away. He loved her, raised her, and chose her as his heir. That choice was his right, and it was the right choice. I'm asking you to uphold his wishes and reject this shameless money grab. When he sat down, I saw several jurors nodding, and I let myself hope for the first time that this nightmare might actually end in justice. Judge Caldwell's ruling came swiftly because the case had never been close despite the dramatics. He didn't even need to send it to a jury deliberation, instead issuing a directed verdict from the bench after closing arguments concluded. I've reviewed the evidence presented in this case, and I find the claims brought by Denise and Travis Holloway to be without merit, contradicted by overwhelming evidence, and frankly insulting to this court's intelligence. His voice was stern, the kind of tone judges reserve for truly frivolous lawsuits that waste everyone's time. The plaintiffs abandoned their 5-year-old daughter in a shopping mall with a note explicitly stating they could not continue being parents. They made no attempt to contact her in 27 years. They now seek to profit from the generosity of the man who gave that abandoned child a home and a family. The lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice, meaning it cannot be refiled. Furthermore, I'm ordering the plaintiffs to pay the defendants' legal fees in the amount of $47,000 and imposing an additional sanction of $15,000 for bringing a frivolous lawsuit clearly motivated by financial gain rather than legitimate legal grievance. The courtroom erupted, and I felt like I could finally breathe after months of suffocating pressure. Denise started crying, but these weren't the performative tears she'd shown during testimony. These were tears of rage and disappointment, the reaction of someone who'd expected an easy payday and just watched it evaporate. Travis stood up and pointed at me, his face red with anger. "This isn't over. You haven't heard the last from us." The bailiff moved quickly to escort them out, and Marshall Blackwell gathered his papers with the resigned air of a lawyer who'd known this was a losing case from the start but had taken it anyway for the billable hours. Geraldine and her family filed out without looking at me, but I could feel their hatred radiating across the courtroom, a toxic cloud of entitlement and greed that had finally been denied. Howard immediately filed separate lawsuits against Geraldine, Preston, Bradford, and Louisa for conspiracy, harassment, and emotional distress, and those cases settled quickly when faced with the mountain of evidence Curtis had compiled. Geraldine was forced to pay restitution, complete community service, and accept probation after the district attorney reviewed the case and filed criminal charges for conspiracy to commit fraud. Preston had judgments and liens placed against his properties. Bradford lost his real estate job when his employer decided they didn't want the negative publicity, and Louisa found herself ostracized from her social circle when the details of her harassment campaign became public knowledge. None of them would face serious jail time, but they were publicly humiliated and financially damaged, and perhaps most importantly, they could never come near me again without violating restraining orders that Howard made sure were ironclad. The media follow-up was swift and satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. Headlines shifted from "Abandoned Daughter Sued by Parents" to "Gold-Digging Bio Parents Lose Lawsuit Against Adopted Daughter," and public opinion, which had been mixed during the trial, solidified firmly in my favor. I declined most interview requests because I didn't want to become a professional victim, living off sympathy and turning my trauma into entertainment. But I did release one statement through Howard's office. "Family is made through love and commitment, not biology. Walter Bennett was my father in every way that matters, and his wishes should have been respected from the start. I hope this case reminds people that DNA doesn't create obligations, and abandonment has consequences. I'm grateful to the court for seeing the truth." The Holloways returned to Kentucky deeper in debt than before, now owing legal fees they'd never be able to pay. Within months, Denise and Travis separated, each blaming the other for the failed lawsuit and the mess their lives had become. Travis was arrested again within a year for another fraud scheme, apparently having learned nothing. Denise remarried quickly to a man she barely knew, still looking for someone else to solve her problems. Their other children remained in foster care, the state having determined years earlier that the Holloways were unfit parents, and that pattern never broke. Some people are incapable of change, trapped in cycles of dysfunction and bad choices, and I stopped feeling any guilt about thriving while they struggled. I hadn't caused their problems, and I certainly didn't owe them rescue. My own healing journey took longer than I'd expected because the lawsuit had ripped open wounds I'd thought were mostly healed. I went back to therapy, this time with a counselor who specialized in complex trauma and adoption issues. I joined a support group for adoptees who dealt with similar situations, and listening to their stories helped me realize I wasn't alone in having biological relatives emerge, demanding money or relationships after years of absence. I worked through layers of feelings I hadn't fully processed. Anger at my biological parents that I'd suppressed for years, fear that I didn't deserve Walter's love, guilt that I'd somehow caused problems for him by being adopted. My therapist helped me understand that I'd spent most of my life waiting for the other shoe to drop, expecting abandonment because that was my first experience with parent-child relationships. Walter's consistent love had been healing, but the lawsuit triggered every old defense mechanism and fear. Slowly, through months of hard work, I began to truly accept that Walter's love had been real and unconditional, that I hadn't manipulated or stolen anything, that I deserved the life and opportunities had given me. I started building a new life deliberately and carefully, honoring Walter's memory by living fully rather than hiding from grief. I joined a prestigious architecture firm where I'd earned my position through merit, working on projects that excited me and using the skills Walter had nurtured. My first major design was an affordable housing community that incorporated universal design principles and community spaces, exactly the kind of architecture that served people rather than just impressing them. The project won recognition, and I felt Walter's pride even though he wasn't there to see it. I met Felix Townsend, a colleague at the firm who was kind and patient and didn't push when I clearly had walls up. Our relationship developed slowly over 2 years, and he understood when I explained my history, never making me feel broken or damaged, just accepting that trust would take time. Eventually, I was ready to let someone in again, and Felix proved worthy of that trust in 1,000 small ways. Selling Walter's house was one of the hardest decisions I made, but I finally understood that I was holding on to the building when what I needed to keep was the love and lessons from the man who'd lived there. I bought a modest home in a neighborhood with tree-lined streets and families who actually knew their neighbors, a fresh start that didn't erase the past but created space for a future. I kept Walter's old drafting table, the one Head taught me to use when I was 9 years old, and set it up in my home office where I could see it every day. I kept the photos, the books Head given me, the stuffed rabbit Mr. Hoppy Hood survived every move and loss, small treasures that connected me to where I'd come from and where I'd found home. The Walter Bennett Foundation became my most meaningful project, established with $500,000 from my inheritance and structured to support foster children aging out of the system. We provided scholarships for college and trade schools, particularly in architecture, engineering, and creative fields where Walter had thrived. We ran a mentorship program connecting professionals with foster youth, replicating the relationship that had saved my life. The first annual fundraiser was terrifying because I had to speak publicly for the first time, standing in front of 200 people and telling my story, but the response was overwhelming. We raised $200,000 that first year, and by year 5, we were supporting over 50 foster youth annually with scholarships, stipends, and mentorship. Every time I met one of the kids in our program, I saw my younger self, scared and defensive but desperately hoping someone would see their potential, and I made sure they knew they mattered. Ruth Morrison, my former caseworker who'd retired years earlier, reached out after seeing news coverage of the foundation. We met for coffee, and she told me something I'd never known. Walter called me before he ever came to the Montgomery home as a volunteer. He said his wife had died, and he felt like his life had lost purpose. He asked if there was a child who needed someone consistent, someone who'd show up. I told him about you, how you'd been through multiple placements and had walls up so high I worried no one would reach you. He said, "Then maybe we can help each other." Tears ran down my face as Ruth spoke, understanding finally that Walter had needed me as much as I'd needed him, that our relationship had been mutual healing, not charity. Ruth became a grandmother figure in my life, attending foundation events, having dinner with Felix and me monthly, providing the kind of intergenerational connection I'd thought I'd never have. An unexpected reconnection came from Mrs. Adelaide Hunt. The neighborhood reported Francine's abuse when I was 7 years old. She'd seen news coverage of the trial and reached out through the foundation's website, asking if I was the same Hazel she'd tried to help decades earlier. We met at a cafe, and Adelaide was older but still had the same kind eyes I remembered. "I've thought about you so many times over the years, wondered if you were okay, hoped you'd found a good home." I thanked her for what she'd done, explaining that her call to authorities that night had gotten me out of a dangerous situation and eventually led to Walter. "You rescued me," I told her, and Adelaide shook her head. "No, honey, you rescued yourself by surviving. I just opened a door." She became part of my chosen family, attending foundation events, and later, much more important celebrations. 5 years after Walter's death, my life looked nothing like I could have imagined during the dark days of the trial. I was 37, married to Felix in a small ceremony surrounded by chosen family and the few biological relatives who'd actually mattered. Walter's cousins who'd stayed in touch and supported me throughout everything. I was pregnant with my first child, a daughter Wed decided to name Dorothy Hazel Townsend, honoring both Walter's late wife and my own journey. My career was thriving. I'd been promoted to senior architect and was leading design teams on projects across the state. The foundation was supporting its 50th foster youth, expanding programs, and creating real change in how the system supported kids who had no one. And crucially, there'd been complete silence from the Holloways and Geraldine's family. They'd moved away, and I never heard from them again, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. Some endings don't need closure or reconciliation, just distance and silence. One afternoon, while decorating the nursery for Dorothy, I found an old photo tucked in a box of Walter's things I'd saved. It was from the day of our adoption finalization, taken in the courthouse, both of us grinning at the camera like Wed won the lottery. Walter looked younger than I remembered him, less tired, happier, and I looked like a kid who'd finally stopped waiting for the world to hurt her. I propped the photo on the dresser and talked to it like I often did when I missed him most. "I'm going to be a mom, Dad. I'm terrified I'll mess it up, but I'm going to try to love her the way you loved me, unconditionally and completely. I'm going to make sure she never doubts that she's wanted." I cried, the happy, sad tears that come when grief and joy exist in the same moment, and then I felt Felix's arms around me from behind, his hand on my growing belly, and I knew Dorothy would be surrounded by love. The lessons I'd learned through years of trauma and healing became the foundation of how I wanted to live and parent. Biology doesn't equal family, and DNA is not destiny. The people who show up consistently, who love without conditions, who stay through the hard times, those are your real family, whether you share genes or not. Chosen family is often stronger than blood ties because it's built on choice rather than obligation. Foster children deserve love, stability, and the same inheritance rights as biological children, and laws need to protect those rights against greedy relatives. Clear estate planning matters because people will surprise you with their greed when money is involved. Not everyone deserves second chances, and boundaries with toxic people are healthy and necessary. Healing is possible even from profound childhood trauma, but it takes work, time, and the willingness to trust again. The story generated enough attention that state legislators took notice, and I was asked to testify before the state legislature about a proposed bill that would strengthen legal protections for adoptive relationships and inheritance rights. The bill, which they nicknamed Walter's Law in his honor, passed with bipartisan support and became a model for other states considering similar legislation. The law made it much harder for estranged biological relatives to contest adoptions or inheritances years after the fact, requiring clear and convincing evidence of undue influence rather than just allegations, and imposing penalties for frivolous lawsuits designed to harass adoptive families. I was proud that something good came from the nightmare, that maybe other families wouldn't have to fight the same battle I'd fought. A full circle moment came when the foundation hosted a holiday toy drive at Riverside Shopping Mall, the same place where I'd been abandoned 32 years earlier. Standing in that mall as an adult, watching families shop and children play, I felt the ghost of 5-year-old Hazel sitting on the bench waiting for parents who'd never return. But I also felt how far I'd come, the woman I'd become despite that trauma, the family I'd built, the life Walter had made possible. During the event, a little girl got separated from her mother and started crying, and I watched security reunite them within minutes, the mother scooping up her daughter with relief and love, and I felt peace. That little girl would be okay. And more importantly, I was okay too. I'd survived, I'd thrived, and I mattered. In my journal that night, I wrote words that felt true for the first time. I spent 27 years carrying abandonment like a stone in my chest, heavy and sharp, defining every relationship and decision. The lawsuit tried to crush me with that same stone, tried to convince me I was still that throwaway kid with no value. But I learned the truth Walter always knew. Abandonment was their failure, their weakness, their loss. It was never a reflection of my worth. Walter saw my worth when I couldn't, and now I finally see it too. And I'll make sure Dorothy never doubts hers, not for a single day of her life. The closing scene of this chapter of my life came on an ordinary evening. Nothing dramatic or cinematic, just real life in its quiet beauty. I sat in the rocking chair Walter had made with his own hands when I was 10, reading a children's book to my pregnant belly, while Dorothy kicked and moved inside me. Felix came home from work, kissed my forehead, and asked about my day in the way married people do, genuinely interested in the small details that make up a life. Our home was filled with photos, Walter and me through the years, Felix and me on our wedding day, Ruth and Adelaide at the Foundation's latest event, images of love and family in all its chosen forms. Walter's old drafting table sat in the corner of the room, and on it were the plans I'd designed for Dorothy's nursery, proof that his legacy lived on in the work I did and the life I built. Sunset light came through the window, golden and warm, and I smiled with a contentment that teenage Hazel wouldn't have believed possible. I've thought a lot about what Walter told me one evening while we sat on his porch during his final year. He said, "Families aren't found, Hazel. They're built, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time, one moment of showing up when it would be easier to walk away." I looked at Felix, at the home we'd created, at the daughter growing inside me, and I understood what Walter meant. Family is the daily choice to love, to stay, to care, to build something bigger than yourself. The Holloways gave me DNA, but they never gave me family. Walter gave me everything that mattered: safety, love, belonging, and the knowledge that I deserved those things. And now I was going to pass that gift forward to Dorothy, and hopefully, she'd pass it forward to her own children someday, a legacy infinitely more valuable than money. So here I am, 37 years old, pregnant with my first child, running a foundation that helps kids like I was, married to a good man, living a life Walter would be proud of. The people who abandoned me got nothing but debt and consequences, exactly what they deserved. The relatives who tried to steal my inheritance are gone, irrelevant, powerless. And I'm here, thriving, building, loving, proving every day that trauma doesn't have to be destiny and that chosen family is real family. If my story teaches anything, I hope it's this. You don't owe your abusers forgiveness, you don't owe toxic relatives access to your life, and you absolutely don't owe anyone who abandoned you a piece of your success. You owe yourself healing, boundaries, and the courage to build the family you deserved all along. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members or stood up against people who felt entitled to something you'd earned? Have you been part of a chosen family that meant more than blood relatives? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because these conversations matter, and your story might help someone else going through something similar. If this story moved you or made you think differently about what family really means, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories like this one, and share this video with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you so much for watching, for listening, and for being part of this community. I hope you're surrounded by people who choose you every day, and if you're not there yet, I hope you find your Walter, your person who shows up and stays. Take care of yourselves, protect your peace, and remember that you're worthy of real, unconditional love.